Thank you for inviting me, I suppose I should introduce myself and say again, apologies from Karen, who's the project lead. She's just been promoted to head of department in the last couple of months, so is permanently drawn off onto other emergency things as today, so she sends her apologies. But to be honest, I do much of the presenting about this project, so I probably know some of this material better than she does at the moment. I assume, can everybody hear me? Should we just do a quick thumbs up for that? Great, thank you, and it was great to meet you all. So my name's Jim. I'm relatively new to being an academic. I got my PhD in 2019, which was all about co-housing and ageing, and I spent the best part of a year hanging out with some three groups, in fact, of co-housers in Berlin. I lived in Berlin for 7-8 years, and that's where I got quite an interest in the subject. I'm now based at Bristol University, and I'm part of a team of 5 or 6 of us, including Karen, whose full-time thing, really, pretty much, is co-housing and ageing and social care between us. And we've done other projects under other names. A couple of years ago, we did a piece of work looking at collaborative housing and as an antidote to loneliness, I guess, for the what was then the Ministry of Housing, Local Government and Communities. They've changed their name. Before that, I did a study of a group who've now moved in together down in Bridport on the south coast, and I am quite active in the UK co-housing network and associated groups and networks. Oh, and I should say I'm also an AWOC in the sense that I'm aging without children. Me and my wife live here in Bristol, but have never had children, I guess, through choice. And I have nieces and nephews around the country, but no proximate family. So anyway, so this current project, which is we've been working on for 2 years so far. It's called CHIC, which was an acronym I thought of, Collaborative Housing and Innovations in Care. It's a 3-year project. We're about 2 years in, and we've just finished our field work with 6 groups. Let me just see if the slides work there. So I suppose I should roll back a bit and talk about co-housing very briefly, but I think with or let's start really with the background. I suppose specifically later life housing, I should say, is always kind of talked about, particularly in academia, as a kind of what we'd call a binary. On one hand, you live in the house that you've always lived in, and then suddenly you move at some point to specialist retirement housing. And what we're calling collaborative housing, I guess, sits between these, with the benefits of some form of group living, but with more autonomy than retirement communities, or well, what we think of traditionally as retirement communities. And what's most important about our definition of collaborative housing is that at a fundamental level, the members, the residents of that group, are in control. So a couple of years ago, we got funding from the National Healthcare Institute for research. Can't remember which way around that goes, but it's basically government funding once again. And we had this question: in what ways might collaborative housing better support social care and the support needs of older people? And in order to do this piece of work, we went out and we identified. We actually asked quite a lot of groups, but it boiled down to 6 collaborative housing communities in England, who we've been looking at for 2 years so far, but it will be a 30-month period. In fact, I'm doing the final visit to a group in Essex tomorrow, where I'll be staying overnight and coming back Friday. And it's been quite a long haul, and I've got to know the groups really well. One of them I knew already. But we've done, between the 5 or 6 of us, we've done over 100 interviews, probably more like 150, multiple focus groups, and an awful lot of drinking tea, coffee, and sometimes something stronger. So the case studies, I'll try not to burble on too much on these, but as I say, we looked at 6 groups altogether, and in as much as collaborative housing is known in academia and the wider world at all, it's co-housing as a model that is the best known. So our 6 case studies included 3 co-housing groups and 3 other groups, which I'll come on to. But here's the 3 co-housing groups. I assume you've all got this up on a big screen? We're not just on a small. Yeah. Oh, so I know there's a lot of information here and writing, but I'm happy to have these slides shared if Sue is able to print them off. Because yeah, the writing is quite small. The other thing I should say here is we've anonymized the names. These are not the real names of groups. Most of the groups were quite happy to be known by their real names, but it was difficult to anonymize one and not anonymize the others. So we made up these names. So we have 3 co-housing schemes. The first one is the only one of the 3 that is specifically by and for older people. In fact, its real name has those words in it. It's a scheme in North London, completed in 2016. And to be honest, if you do know about co-housing, you will know of this scheme. They've done a lot of media. They've done some TV recently. Most recently they were on a thing with Kathy Burke about aging a few weeks back. They are largely owner occupied, but there's 8 socially rented units, and it's a women-only scheme, nominally for women between their 50s and their 90s. There is no strict lower or indeed upper age limit. The second scheme, which we're calling Meadow Ridge, is kind of a comparable scheme, and this is the one I'm visiting tomorrow, but it's more intergenerational, although at the moment the members are all over 50. There's some disagreement, actually. When I sat down on the very first day I met them and said, what made you want it to be a so-called senior co-housing group? And they corrected me, and some of them said, we're not a senior co-housing group, which is people of all ages. Others are much keener on being a sort of over 50s group, because they feel, well, I'll come on to this whole subject, but they feel there's more in common in terms of mutual support of a group who are largely retired. And the third one that we're calling Sundial Yard is the longest established scheme, actually, 20 years old this year, a bit bigger, and I would say more genuinely intergenerational. They've over the 20 years, they started out with a mix of young families kind of up to people in their 50s, 60s, but of course 20 years has, because there's such a low turnover, those ages have all gone up. The youngest people have tended to grow up and leave the parental home, so they're now largely kind of middle-aged to older. The oldest member, I think, we actually put it on there, I'm not sure, from memory, is just into her 90s now. And then 3 other schemes that don't often come under this kind of umbrella term of collaborative housing, but a colleague of mine had done some work. His background was in housing cooperatives, and he said to me, there's a couple around the country of housing cooperatives and other schemes where the residents have in different ways put themselves in charge. Well, one of these, the first one, is in Bath, and it looks very posh. It's not actually quite as expensive as you think, and it's relatively affordable for that part of the world. So it was built as a pretty standard McCarthy and Stone retirement development, and then McCarthy and Stone sold it on to somebody else. In 2008, the leaseholder residents got together, and under right to buy legislation, they set up a right to management company, and they legally, forcibly took over the management, lock, stock and barrel of that development. So they run things now. They don't own the freehold, so they don't own the land that the thing sits on, but they all own and control their own homes and all the common parts and all the decisions, particularly cost decisions, that are made about that scheme. The second one describes itself as very sheltered housing, which I think is kind of similar to what we in the industry would call extra care. And this is a slightly different one because the company that built it handed over full control of the development and the community to those resident members when they built the thing 30 odd years ago. So it's a requirement, if you move into this place, that you become a member of the management company on a legal basis, and you are then responsible for management of that community and its assets, so the roads, the housing, the hub building, and everything that goes on there. So that's that one. The third one that we're calling Cedar Bank it's one of only two, I think, in the country, housing cooperatives built by and for older people, and that one was set up again in 1985, I think, and basically they're all social renters, but the housing co-op owns all the housing on these two sites, and each of the renters is a member of the co-op. So there's nobody else in charge. There's nobody above that that either owns the co-op or controls it. So although they're all renters, they have full control of their housing and their lives as a community together. So I hope that will make sense. This is the first time. It's early days for us, by the way, because we're finishing the field work and we're just going into kind of starting to think about what we found out and what we need to tell people. So this is a useful kind of first practice run with a friendly crowd, I hope, friendly, to kind of work through some of these things. So that's why I'm emphasizing these early findings. So yes, talking about the three co-housing groups first of all, because they kind of fit together as a group. They have more in common than what they don't have in common. So there are, it varies across the groups, but as I guess you'd expect, really, given the nature of these groups, there's a high proportion of those living without significant support from children or family, especially due to geographic location of schemes. And just to touch on that, really, it's quite an interesting, it was interesting actually to hear you all introduce yourselves, because it was a reminder to me that this term AWOC, aging without children, is not a black and white thing. It's not that some of us literally don't have children, but for many people, and many people that we met in these groups, sometimes they do have children, but they might be not close to those kids, or children live in sometimes on other continents and are not there to be able to be supportive, or the parents have moved away at an earlier age, and also there was an interesting motivation even for some of those members with who did have children close by. When we talked to people about their motivations for moving into co-housing, it was quite often the case that people would say, well, I don't want to rely on my children when I'm older in the same way that my parents relied on me. So there's a kind of a sort of AWOC by choice to some extent. I think the proof will be in the pudding of that one, and we're beginning to unwrap how those relationships might work. It's just occurred to me, actually, at the risk of burbling slightly and jumping about, I didn't really define co-housing. I'm assuming that it's a familiar term, but it might well not be. But co-housing is basically a housing scheme that is built, designed, organised by its residents, who each have their own individual homes. So you have a front door to your flat or your house, and you can go home and lead your own life privately whenever you want, but also you have these shared parts of the development. So in the case of, actually you can see it as a background picture, I'll just click back. Sundial Yard, that third scheme, you can see hopefully in the top right corner. So it also has this common house over 3 stories, which includes a laundry, a TV, movie room, and kind of other shared spaces. There's a games room, there's a kitchen where the group cooks together up to 3 times a week. Again, not compulsory. Nothing is really compulsory in co-housing. But there's when you move in, you commit to being a part of the community to some extent. You don't have to join in with everything, but you acknowledge that you work towards a shared goal of mutual support and being part of this community. So going back to these findings, I guess, it's no surprise that we found strong social organisation through shared activity, which was sort of supported by the housing design. The thing about these schemes is they're designed so that it's very difficult, even if you wanted to kind of sneak around. You bump into people, people's homes overlook each other. They quite often have small private gardens, but also a lot of common garden space. So there's a sense that you are very much part of a community by design. And one of the things that all 3 of these co-housing communities have kind of signed up to in their commitment is that through a better quality of life and through mutual support, that will play a preventative health role and aid everybody's well-being. And I think it's, although that's a very difficult thing for us academics to measure, like how well does it support your health, in the sense that you don't get as ill and you don't have to go to hospital as much. It's almost impossible to measure because it's a negative. But we're pretty convinced that, especially given that loneliness plays a significant negative role in health and well-being, I think communities of people who look out for each other are almost by definition doing a positive good. But beyond that, we found many examples of mutual support across the groups. And one of the most striking things, and I guess the most obvious, that if one of the members is in hospital for a stay, and obviously this is a very newsworthy theme at the moment, that person is able to come home much faster and be released from hospital faster than they otherwise would have been. And quite often there's a bit of joined up healthcare thinking beginning to happen around these groups, that doctors are more confident of signing off patients because they know that they'll be supported when they go back into the group. Each of the groups does have unsurprisingly kind of agreed written limits around what they'll do. The first of the women only group in North London have this phrase that we look out for each other but not after each other, and they're very keen to point out that they're not there as personal carers for each other and never will be. Having said that, they do often go much further on an individual basis. So far with that group, many people have kind of some help and support, running from cleaners through to more personal care for those aging with disabilities. But kind of above that, they have this level of the whole group looking out for each other and helping them organize their lives. And this another kind of phrase that we've kind of come up with to apply here, which gets overlooked, I think, when you're talking about social care, is what we're calling advocacy, or perhaps this kind of brokerage role. And what I mean by this is some of the things that traditionally adult children would do. So we're talking about liaison between existing health services and social care services and that individual. And especially at the scheme that I've got the background picture there, there was a guy long-term who had Parkinson's. He's moved out recently, but only recently. He lived there for 7 or 8 years as a group member, and a smaller sort of group of 4 or 5 people that we called an advocacy group kind of self-assembled around him and made sure that they and he liaised with both the NHS and with the local authority to get him the care and support, the professional care and support that he needed. He did have 2 children. The son he wasn't close to, had a difficult relationship with, and his daughter lived in Australia. And although both have played minor roles in his care and the care home that he's now gone into, I would say that the group played a much more major role. As a caveat to that, I would say that towards the end of his time living with the group, it placed a great strain on those 4 or 5 people around him. Having said that, I think that the equivalent work would have placed a great strain on the son or daughter had they been more available. So we're still kind of untangling those relationships and how they work, but I'll come back to that shortly. Something that I suppose in the context of AWOC is slightly less relevant, but what was interesting in several cases is in another group there was a guy who was terminally ill, and his son came over from Australia, but was able to stay with the group and be supported in turn by the group, because he was finding giving support to his father quite challenging, especially not in his home country, and he was unfamiliar with social services and how everything worked. So there's a big question in social care about who cares for the carers, in effect, and the toll it takes on them. And I think there's a very important role that groups play in supporting the supporters, in looking out for the people whose whole life becomes that of a carer. And just as a last thought on this, so far in the UK, in Germany and other countries it's different, but so far in the UK these are largely private models unless there's a piece of specific funding. So they do tend to be kind of middle class, if we're being honest, because those are the people who've been able to afford to put these schemes together. On the other hand, in all 3 of the co-housing schemes, people are living there with no additional care fees or care services to pay for, as opposed to residential retirement communities or extra care. Did I say everything about that? I've got loads and loads of notes here, but I could waffle on for hours, but I'll see if there's anything else to pick out for. Oh, actually, the other thing to say was at Hazel Lanes, that the women-only community, they formally established a buddy system where like smaller groups of 2 or 3 people kind of perform this looking out for role. And one of the important things I think that they've done is they've agreed as a group and supported each other to make sure everyone's written their wills together and that they've named a power of attorney, which in 2 or 3 cases has turned out to be very important. And for many of those members, the named power of attorney to look after their affairs will be a son or daughter, usually a daughter. But at least that's established a clear situation, and in some cases, a person has named another person in the group, or another person in the group. Not generally, but sometimes. It's not seen as the purpose of the group members to necessarily go that far, but the group supports each other in making those decisions, if that makes sense. What's next? Oh yeah, so the early findings on these, what we're calling the others groups, because we don't really have a single name for them. I sympathise with you all trying to get your heads around this. It's taken me a year to try and get my head around these different models of housing, and we can't really define it any better than as the individual groups. They tend to be, particularly in the case of the housing cooperatives, set up usually in the 80s and 90s. They were usually set up as social housing or as heavily subsidized housing, so they tend to be more affordable and accessible than the co-housing model is in the UK. It doesn't have to be that way. In the Netherlands, there are over 300 co-housing groups, intergenerational and for older people, and a majority of them were set up with a larger part of government funding than anything else. It's just that in the UK it hasn't played out that way. One of the things that makes these groups different from the co-housing is that all 3 have paid support staff, i.e. collaboratively taken on and paid rather than paid by any individual who lives in the scheme. And those staff tend to be, so I'm thinking of the co-op example, the housing co-op that's in Liverpool, tends to be much more embedded than I think would be the case in kind of retirement developments or extra care or care homes normally. And of the 2 women who work as the site managers at this particular housing co-op, we saw them becoming almost social workers on some occasions. On other occasions, they'd almost play that family son and daughter role. And on one quite bizarre occasion, the co-op and its staff discovered that the 2 children of one of the cooperative members was actually ripping off the social care benefit that member was receiving. So the resident at the co-op wasn't getting the help and care that they needed, and the kids were making off with the cash, essentially. And that was only noticed because I think the staff at the co-op were so heavily based at that site and so embedded. So there's almost a kind of, it's like the sort of negative opposite of AWOC in a way, that the co-op's looking out for its members despite some of the activities of the children. But I think that was quite an extreme case. One of the other differences between co-housing and these other schemes is that although self-manage is important for some of the group, you don't commit to a collective social life. You could move into one of these schemes and have pretty much not much to do with it. You wouldn't have to hang out with everybody else, although they have plenty of social activities. And also, although as a co-op member and as a leaseholder in the other 2 schemes, you do have to vote occasionally on certain issues, you don't have to join the management committee. And all 3 schemes, the actual management's usually done by a core smaller group of people, as is so often in the way in life. Most people opt out, a few people sort it out for the rest of us. But I think actually it brings me on to that next point, the process of having to manage your own housing collectively does draw people in a bit more. The scheme down the road from me here in Bath, down the road from Bristol, last year I went to their AGM, and compared to my own personal experience of such things, it was a really good turnout. Out of 50 odd residents, nearly everybody was there, and everybody seemed quite engaged. I suppose it's, you know, they're paying themselves for the decisions that are made, so it's important that they all see that it's done right. But most importantly, I think, with the example of one of the co-ops, was that self-management had clear benefits. The co-op used to share its housing management and site wardens and staff with a housing association literally next door. The housing all kind of looks the same, and you can't tell street by street what's co-op and what's housing association. But a couple of years ago, the housing association withdrew its funding of those on-site staff. So the only support that residents now get is at the end of a phone line, and by all accounts it's not very good support, whereas the co-op decided, its members made the decision to keep those supporting two staff who are still there, and if anything are kind of still drawn into supporting the whole community to some extent. And because the state is increasingly, and quite dreadfully, I think, withdrawing more and more support, community hubs, local social services are being defunded and withdrawn. It's notable how the co-op is kind of the last man standing almost, and has become a hub now for the wider community. Everybody now goes to the co-op because they know they've got a social space, and there's people there who know what they're doing, and they can get advice. And I think the co-op needs to start to be careful about how much of itself it gives to the wider community, really, because I can see them exhausting themselves. This you won't be able to read this at all because it's tiny writing from where you'll be sat, but I will just jump through. What this is showing is a thing that we're doing at the moment. We've taken some what we're calling transitions of a couple of individuals in the different groups, and we're looking at what happens and who supports whom over time when somebody gets ill or needs a major operation, or sadly in the case of this guy, Eric, we're calling him, not his real name, his wife died 5 years ago, and his son lives abroad. This was the guy I mentioned in Australia, and 2 years ago he was diagnosed with I believe it was lung cancer, and he died sadly last year, but all but his very, very last day was spent supported by and within the community of that group, again by 2 or 3 members. Particularly, one of the group happened to be a retired doctor, which I guess helped. But one of the neighbours was a retired physio, and although that's probably exceptional for any randomly selected group of 30 or 40 people, it was notable how people really stepped up and used what skills they had. And particularly, all of this happened, he was diagnosed and went downhill quite quickly through the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, and the health service, to be fair, they had a lot on their minds, but were in chaos at the time, and palliative care really didn't come through for the guy, particularly in the early stages. And the group decided to make a rule for 5 or 6 of them that they were a single household for the sake of supporting him, which was kind of a brave move back in early 2020 when nobody really understood what was going on. Clearly, least of all our own Prime Minister, but that's another matter. Here is a kind of diagram that we've evolved to show the relationships between Eric and the community and who did what, and including Eric's son off to the side there. This was during the early period that he was diagnosed as terminally ill. And we picked apart in some detail really who did what and how this, what we're calling this advocacy role, worked out, who was able to support him and how they related to the emergency services and then to his GP, and then later on, I think on another slide, to the you'll see just down at the bottom towards the right, we've got the GP and care workers, but all kind of feeding in to Eric's support. The son at this point had moved in, had come over from Australia for a couple of months and moved in with his dad, but the son also was being supported by the rest of the community. I hope this is, by the way, this isn't going into too massive details. It's very much everything that's in my head. This is the first time I've had to kind of spill it all out, but maybe we can, if there's questions, or we can talk about it further. So where do we get to? Yeah, I've called this last part conclusions and further questions. Really, it's very few conclusions and a lot of further questions. I mean, to start with, I guess it's clear that all the schemes that we looked at had enormous benefits for their members in terms of being part of a social community, in terms of mutual support, in terms of just a better way of living, with friendship and support around them. And I think co-housing had a much stronger community and informal social support on one side, less so the other three groups, but they had the benefit of these formalized built-in services to various different degrees. A couple of things which we're thinking of as kind of questions at the moment, which we don't fully understand, and we might go back to groups and talk to them. In the three co-housing groups, it was interesting that despite all having come together mainly to kind of support each other in later life, some people without children, some people with children, but all having this common goal, when it really came down to it, there was a reluctance to plan for sort of technical full-on future care needs. And maybe part of that is just because as you guys were all discussing earlier, it's impossible to foresee how things will play out. It's impossible to know what care you'll need in years to come. But we did wonder whether there's a role to be played for a kind of external agency that supports these groups when they need it. In the case, jumping ahead really, but in the case of the housing co-op up in Liverpool, although they employ 2 staff, the care services that the group gets is from what's called an umbrella co-op, which is a co-op co-owned by them and by other primary co-ops. So they have control over that care as well, but it's kind of farmed out to another organisation, if that makes sense, who specialise in care. And I'm very interested, maybe for a future project, in looking at 1 or 2 social care cooperatives that are springing up, so far only in the north of England. I think there's one in Newcastle and there's one in Manchester. They're only just getting off the ground, but they're taking this idea, which is not housing based so much, but is more wider community based, about whether you can share and control these kind of support and care services. Another thing to mention is there's a bit of it's a paradox really with these co-housing schemes. The problem is that the residents have created such good neighbourhoods to live in that nobody ever moves out. And I mean, the joke is that they're only leaving in a box, and so far that's happened a few times, but what the problem is then led to is that you get a cohort or a sort of single generation of people all aging together, and particularly the older women's co-housing group in North London are concerned. It hasn't really happened yet, but about getting new blood in, as they all, like at the moment, they still have a fair range of ages, but what happens when they're all in their 80s, 90s, even into their hundreds, and trying to mutually support each other, and it becomes more and more of a burden. So I think what we're calling succession planning is quite an important issue about making sure that you have a good range of ages in your group, from even what we're calling older people. I mean, I'm 53 and I'm already technically into our scope of older later life, but 50 is very different from 90 or 95, as we could probably discuss at length. And the other thing, should these schemes factor in designing accommodation for live-in carers? The three schemes that we looked at, they all felt that they should. We wonder if that places too big a burden on one or two people who kind of move in as carers for 30 others. It might work great, but I think it's difficult to be a carer with 30 of your employers all around you 24/7, and your housing to rely on that. More further questions. I think on the other side, these other groups have kind of nailed that one about how to manage the care services. But one of our questions is, does having those care services on tap kind of make it there's less onus to be involved and manage your own affairs? So people it feels like less of a community, although there is some sense of community there, but perhaps in many ways that's not such a problem. That's I would think a lot of people would find the co-housing model quite full on, to be honest. They're certainly not communes, but there's a communal feel to them. One scheme in particular, we wonder if there's an over-reliance on some of the founder members who are like the font of all knowledge for these schemes and know how everything works. We think they might have to think more carefully about sharing the burden of leadership, if you like. And the last point really that I've touched on already, how fair are some of these schemes on the staff who, in the case of the housing co-op at least, live in with the group. They get their housing as part of their employment package, and they seem happy enough to go above and beyond what their job remit is. But I wonder if in the long term, if that's really fair, if it wouldn't be better for care and support staff and site managers to be sort of one step away, removed in their employment from the group itself. Oh, that's just something about the funding. So that's me really. Apologies if that's a bit of a ramble through it. As I say, this is the first time I've kind of presented all the information that we've got so far at this kind of level. There's a ton more that I could say, and probably lots of things that I've forgotten to say. But I'll leave it there, and then we can have a chat about it. So thank you very much.